Thank you.
On 27 February, we witnessed a historic vote in the European Parliament. MEPs voted to approve the first ever EU-wide nature restoration law to tackle the existential climate and biodiversity crisis. The S&D group, which we in Labour are now deeply proud to be represented in, following the election last night of my dear friend Deputy Ivana Bacik, that group was instrumental in seeing passage of this important directive. The first major new EU biodiversity law since the 1992 Habitats Directive, and it deserves all of our support. Unfortunately, there's been opposition to the nature restoration law, expressed by those who are outright climate change deniers, but also those whom we might, I think, describe as climate change tolerators, those who engage in insidious undermining of the necessary measures that we need to tackle biodiversity loss and the climate crisis. Those who express opposition on some vague basis to this nature restoration law. And, Minister, I listened in disbelief to the speeches from the Sinn Féin members just now, who say they are for nature restoration, but against the nature restoration law, for some vague and ill-defined reasons. I listened in disbelief to hear them say we do not need the EU to protect biodiversity. Of course we do. We need solidarity on a trans-European and transnational basis in order to address what is an international and transnational crisis. And I wondered to myself what another newly elected MEP, Lynn Boylan, might make of the speeches that I've been listening to, and we've all been listening to, from Sinn Féin in the Dáil today. They were extraordinary. So I'm very glad that Deputy Oireachtas' election last night staved off the threat of another climate change tolerator to the European Parliament. I'm very sorry, however, that it was at the expense of the Green Party MEP. And I want to pay tribute, Minister, to your colleague, former MEP Kieran Cuff, who I have the utmost respect for and who's played an enormously important role in the European Parliament on climate issues. And I hope we'll see Grace O'Sullivan hold her seat. We've seen some very damaging action from what would historically have been seen as the centre-right ground at the European level recently. EPP MEPs submitted amendments amounting to a boycott of the legislation and were joined by European Conservatives and Reformists, as well as the far-right identity and democracy groups in the Parliament. And I want to commend Fine Gael MEPs who faced down pressure from within their own grouping, and that is to their credit. But it's concerning, now that the final votes in the European election are being counted, that the EPP is courting parties which are climate-denying parties. It's courting those groupings. And the EPP as a grouping is standing in the way now of the sort of progress on climate and biodiversity that we need to see. The leader of the EPP, Manfred Weber, who the EPP had initially sought to make Chief Commissioner, really embarked on what can only be described as a personal crusade to kill the nature restoration law. And that's a real worry then when we see the EPP gaining ground. And I again want to express my relief that Dublin voters have recognised the importance of a counterbalance to the EPP in electing our first Socialist and Democrat MEP from Ireland in a decade in Deputy Oireachtas' election. We've seen fear-mongering, we've seen disinformation, and we've seen indifference, which have caused confusion around the nature restoration law. But its aims are simple. It aims to restore at least 20% of the EU's land and sea areas by 2030 and all its ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. And this is absolutely crucial because we've seen more than 80% of Europe's assessed natural habitats being in poor condition. We've seen in Ireland really devastating loss of wetlands, 90% of wetlands. Draining, mining and the use of wetlands and peatlands for farming has meant that 85% of peatlands we have are degraded and in poor condition. We're seeing human-driven change driving ecological collapse. We're living through an extinction event. It's deeply distressing to hear that birds that we've been used to hearing songs from are now endangered. Future generations will be robbed of the joy of hearing the songs of corncrakes, of hen harriers, of curlews, who are silently going silent in many areas where they were once heard. Algae covering Lough Neagh, poisoning local wildlife, endangering human health, native tree species struggling for space. We have to change this. And Minister, I think we were all heartened by the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, and I hope we'll see those implemented, because they really illustrate the power of politics to make pivotal and transformational change, to stem that ecological collapse that we're seeing. And we've seen again at European level, real leadership from within the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats as well as within the Green grouping. And I want to commend Cesar Luena from the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats from our sister party in Spain, who was chief negotiator on the nature restoration law, who put immense commitment into, along with so many others in the Green movement and the centre-left movement, to see this vital law passed. And that's what it takes, that sort of political leadership at European level and at national level. It's what it takes to secure the necessary changes to address climate loss and climate change. That's what it takes to secure a just transition, which is an integral component of our Labour Party climate action policies. And I do want to thank our colleagues in the Regional Independent Group for introducing this motion today, because it gives us a valuable opportunity to discuss the issues facing us all, facing those in the farming sector too. I acknowledge that the government will not oppose the motion, but I do acknowledge also that concerns at aspects of the text of the motion have been expressed by some environmentalists, notably by Friends of the Earth. There's some inaccuracies, I think, within the motion before us. For example, Article 1, subsection 2 says this regulation establishes a framework within which Member States shall put in place effective and area-based restoration measures with the aim to jointly cover as a union target throughout the areas and ecosystems within the scope of this regulation at least 20% of land areas and at least 20% of sea areas by 2030 and all ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. This is a union-level target covering all Member States rather than a Member State-level target. So that's an important correction. Secondly, the target relates to area-based restoration measures. So existing agri-environmental schemes which have the objective of incentivising farmers to manage habitats sustainably, these would qualify as examples of an area-based restoration measure. And thirdly, there's an assumption within the motion that restoration implies that habitats are not farmed, whereas in reality, farming is essential to the management of many of these protected semi-natural habitats. I've spoken before in this House about the success of some of these agri-environmental schemes, like the Burren Bio project in the Burren and County Clare, with which I'm very familiar, and which has really been so successful in incorporating farming methods with protection of habitats and biodiversity. This is part of our just transition, and it's only with the input of those who are being asked to make changes, with their input and bringing them with us, that any government can adequately identify, address or avoid issues of climate change. That is what we mean by a just transition, and it applies within the agriculture community, within farming families, as much as it applies to all of us in urban and rural settings. The very nature of farming requires skill, it requires flexibility, and my experience of meeting farmers from across the country shows and is evidence that they are willing and eager to make a difference. But they must be treated with respect, and farming communities must be brought with us, just as every community must be brought with us to tackle what is, as I've said, this existential threat. And it's that spirit of just transition, I think, which drives the measures that are advocated in this nature restoration law. And it's what we must embrace as our spirit here at national level, just as we've seen the S&D grouping, the Green grouping at European level embrace that spirit when it comes to tackling this existential threat of biodiversity and climate loss.
I now call on the Leader of the